when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Now, the person in the midst of problems, it's hard for them to consider their problems as all joy. But as we've talked about in the Song of Solomon, problems are a natural part of life. That's what life is about, is learning how to solve problems. And I have down here that codependents don't solve problems. They endure problems for years and years, and then they pass them on to their children. So if we're going to count it all joy in problems, it's solving the problems that brings us joy. Solving the problems and seeing God's wisdom and seeing how we grow in solving that problem. Then we can count it as joy because we know that we're becoming a more productive and a better person because of solving them. And then, through solving problems gives us the opportunity to experience God's wisdom. And in Ephesians 3, verse 10, is a passage that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, talking about the wisdom of God, and Paul's talking about his ministry to the Gentiles. And he says, in order that the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known through the church to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly places. This passage is talking about that through the church, the angels, the rulers in the heavenly places, are looking down at the church and they are seeing God's wisdom. Now, when they're looking down at the church, they're not seeing the organization. They're not seeing the elders and the deacons and the saints and how that all the organization is exactly by God's word. Because the church is not the organization. The church is the people. They're looking down and they're seeing the people solving their problems according to God's wisdom. They're seeing the people learning how to get along with each other. They're seeing the people overcome tremendous problems in their lives through God's wisdom, and they are marveling at God's wisdom. This is a concept that has taken me about 6 years to understand and to appreciate. I guess it's been about 7 years now, I went through what I would call a spiritual crisis. I got where I just absolutely hated problems. It seemed like the church that we were working with, this one problem after another, just continual problems. And some of them weren't getting solved. They were being drug on and carried on. And there were so many problems and so many emotionally wrenching problems that my husband and I, we didn't have time for ourselves. We didn't have time for our problems, for the normal problems of a growing and changing family. And I began to resent other people's problems. And I began to tell my husband, I'm starting to think of the church as my enemy. And began to talk to him about, why don't you give up preaching, because this is not worth the sacrifices that we're having to make. And I reached a point in my life where I had to sit back and completely re-examine my attitude towards everybody and everything, towards God, towards the church, and come back and think about it. And it was fortunate in that soon after that, my husband left that place and we moved up to Seattle. And we took the whole summer off and we traveled the East Coast and camped out for 2 months, slept in a tent for 2 months, and had lots of time to think and to meditate. And we had time to stop and to talk about these things and to readjust our attitude. And I had the opportunity to realize that problems aren't unusual. Problems are the normal thing of life. This is normal, and the abnormal thing is letting them drag on and to not solve problems. And that problems are really a good thing because they stimulate us. They make us grow. They stretch our thinking. They make us look at things in a different way if we are solving them. And so I changed my attitude towards problems. I don't think I've resented a single problem since then. I don't say, oh boy, but I'm not threatened by them, and I know that God's wisdom will come and we'll be able to solve them through His wisdom. But about a year ago, after we had been dealing with some teenage problems, I woke up one morning and the first thought that popped in my mind was to say, thank you, God, for problems, because without problems, we cannot experience God's wisdom, because that's what God's wisdom is good for. It's good for solving problems. And if we don't have any problems in our life, and if we're not solving our problems according to God's wisdom, then we cannot truly experience the magnificence of God's wisdom. We can't really know God as He really is, how valuable He is for solving problems. And this is something I'm sure that's hard for someone who is in the midst of problems, but it is something, I'm putting this out there as a goal to work towards, because we can experience God's wisdom. We can be like those angels in the heavenly places that are looking down, marveling at God's wisdom, who knows how to make people who have independent spirits, who have free wills. He knows how to guide them so that they can get along with each other, and we can experience God's wisdom. So this is an important aspect. Then we need to give our marriage to God. And these next parts here are not in your notes. I had this typed up on outline form, and I have this part of the outline was compacted, and so it didn't print. So you'll have to take this down. So what we need to do is to give our marriage to God, to realize that God doesn't guarantee marital happiness. And sometimes it's God's will that a marriage not be everything that it should be for God's benefit, so that God can benefit from it. For example, God told the prophet Hosea to marry a harlot in Hosea 1, verses 2 through 9, and then in 3, verses 1 through 2. He told her to marry a harlot so that Hosea could understand God's feelings when his people went and played the harlot with idolatry, and Hosea could preach in a way that he would not have been able to otherwise. Then God told Jeremiah not to get married, so that when he went and preached to the people, and told him this in Jeremiah 16, verses 2 through 7, told him not to get married so that when he preached to the people, he could tell them how that they weren't going to be enjoying marriages in their lives because of the captivity that was coming upon them, and that they needed to repent. Then God told Ezekiel that his wife was going to die, and for him not to mourn her, so that when the people saw this and asked him why he wasn't mourning his wife, that they could tell him, or he could tell them, because the day is going to come when you're going to lose your wife and your sons and your daughters, because God is bringing destruction upon you because of the wickedness in your life. That's in Ezekiel 24, verses 16 through 21. Then the first century Christians were told to make sacrifices in their marriages and owning land and doing the things that we think is a happy part of marriage. In 1 Corinthians 7, verses 25 through 38, simply because there was a persecution coming upon them, that they were going to have to endure and to remain faithful, and that God wanted them to give up these normal pleasures of happy marriage. Then Jesus tells us that we are to love God more than our spouse, more than our mother and our father, in Matthew 10, verses 34 through 39. So the point I'm making is that sometimes God requires that a person give up the happiness of their marriage so that they can obey God, so that they can be a useful tool to Him. And indeed, many times people who've gone through miserable marriage relationships, they have become very effective teachers. They have become very effective elders because they have an understanding that someone without problems does not have. So problems may be something that God is wanting to work in our life in a way that we don't understand. And so we need to recognize that problems can be for our benefit, and then to give our marriage to God. Then I want us to talk about our relationship to ourselves, because if we don't know how to love ourselves, then it's not going to be possible for us to truly love other people. And if we're going to love ourselves, the first thing we need to do is we need to recognize our personal responsibility and to accept responsibility for ourselves. Instead of trying to control the other person, accept responsibility for controlling ourselves. And in Proverbs 9, verse 12, it says, "If you are wise for yourself, and if you scoff, you alone will bear it." So the idea is whatever is in your mind, your attitudes, you reap the benefits. If you're a wise person, you reap the benefits. If you're a scoffer, someone who ridicules and makes fun at other people and at God and whatever else is going on, you're the one that's going to reap those benefits. So basically, we're the one we affect the most. Our thoughts affect us the most, more than anyone else. Then in 1 Peter 1, verses 13 through 15, in 1 Peter 1, verses 13 through 15, it says, "Therefore, gird your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance. But like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior. Because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy." So here it is, God is laying on us our own personal responsibility, that we're to gird up our minds, to take control of our thoughts, and that we are to be holy as He is holy. And holy, I have in your notes, I think I have it up here on transparency, that holy is a form of the word sanctify that we've talked about before. You be set apart. You be different. You be in control of your actions. So, first of all, we need to recognize our own personal responsibilities. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. Okay, as we continue seeing how to love ourselves, the next thing we can do to love ourselves is to keep our life right with God. In Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5, this is where it's talking about judging lest you not be judged. And then, and it's also talking about when you have the mote in your eye. Let's see, Matthew 7. It says, do not judge lest you be judged yourselves, for in the way you judge you will be judged, and by your standard of measure it shall be measured to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly enough to take the speck out of your brother's eye. We talked about this passage last week, talking about how sin grows, and when a person's involved in sin, that they can't see clearly. And tonight what we want to do is we want to apply this passage to ourselves, that if we're not doing everything that we should in our marriage, then we can't see clearly. We can't think clearly. We can't draw good conclusions. One thing I've noticed as I've taught classes, that it's not unfrequent for a gal to come to class in about the middle of the classes and be just as angry as she can be. And she'll be very angry and she'll say, it's not fair. Why do I have to do everything? And all he does is just soak it up. Why do I have to make all the sacrifices? It's not fair. And when she reaches this stage, it's a stage that I call a crisis, and it's a good kind of a crisis. When she reaches this stage, she's got to make a decision. She's got to decide whether she's going to continue to do the things that we've been learning in class because God wants her to do them, or if she's going to do them to manipulate her husband. If she's doing these things, practicing subjection, practicing reverence, all of these things to manipulate her husband and to try to get a change in him, then it's not going to work. That husband's going to sense that. He's going to feel manipulated, and it's not going to work. But once she makes the decision, I'm going to do these things regardless of what he does. I'm going to do these things because God commands me to do them. I'm going to love my husband. I'm going to reverence my husband. I'm going to be submissive to my husband because God commands me to. I'm going to do them for God and because so that I can be right with God. Once the woman makes that decision, then that's when things really start to change, because she becomes a different person, and her husband no longer is feeling manipulated, and there begins to be a difference in the marriage. Along with that if she's beginning to see the things that she needs to do, then if she will confess her faults to her husband, then she's going to be reaping more benefits. In Matthew 5, verses 23 through 24, here it says, if therefore you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar, and go your way first, and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. I had a girl in my class whose husband was not a Christian. He was what she would call an agnostic, a very skeptical type person. And he was very bitter and resentful towards her. He was, she called him a professional college student, continually going to school, and she stayed home. She was a young woman. She stayed home taking care of their two children. And her husband, we lived in Spokane, where it gets very cold and bitter in the wintertime. And so she said that in the wintertime, he left the air conditioner that was in their window. He left it up in the wintertime, and the cold air was blowing in through the air conditioner, and she and the children were freezing all day long. But he didn't care. He wasn't at home. It didn't bother him, and so he felt no special need to take that down for her. He was continually criticizing her. Why don't you go get a job and make yourself useful? And seemed to have a very low opinion of her and a low opinion of women. This is back when the feminist movement was getting rolling, and she would say when they get together with friends, he'd make comments that he was very pro-feminist, that women ought to be out working and doing these kind of things, and why should she be home taking care of the children? Well, she began to come to class, and even though her husband was an agnostic and cared nothing about the Bible, she would go home and tell her husband. She'd say, "Oh, I learned in class today that I need to quit nagging you." And she would quit nagging him. He didn't have, or she wouldn't say, "I learned in class." She'd say, "I learned that the Bible says I need to quit nagging you." And she would quit nagging him. But she would continually do that. She'd say, "I learned in the Bible to quit doing this or to start doing this." And she would do it. And he didn't have to wonder why she was changing. Is she doing this to manipulate me, or what does she want? He knew she was doing it because she was convicted, and that was what she needed to be doing. And in the course of this 8-week course of classes, this girl's husband really changed. He not only took down the air conditioner, he began to brag on her to their friends about how wonderful it was to come home to a wife who had baked bread and done other things, and was just really bragging on her because she confessed the things that she was doing wrong to him, so that he knew why she was changing. So confessing faults is something that reaps benefits. And you let your husband know, "I'm changing, I'm not going to be doing this anymore, and here's why." Then, as we continue to look at how we love ourselves, another way that we love ourselves is that we don't participate in sin. In 1 Corinthians 6, or not in 1 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians 6, verses 14 through 18. Okay, here it says, in verses 14 through 18, it says, "Do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Christ with Belial? Or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? Or what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, just as God said, 'I will dwell in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people.' Therefore come out from amongst their midst, and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean, and I will welcome you. And I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty." So here it is. God tells us that we are not to have joint participation with sinners. We're not to be joining in with them in their sin. You know, last week after we looked at the many different kinds of sin that are prevalent in a home, I'm convinced that a lot of the sin that takes place in this world takes place in the home. And the wife is the one that knows about it. She's the one that has the opportunity to be a joint participator in sin. So this is something that is very real to the woman. Do not be a joint participator. Participate in sin. Set boundaries. And the boundaries we were talking about earlier. That means if we're not going to participate in sin, that means there's not going to be any more harangues. We're not going to listen to harangues, because if we listen to harangues, then we are participating in it. We are encouraging that person to continue and to get worse in that harangue. There's not going to be any more motive judging. If you judge my motives, then I will point that out to you, and I will not judge your motives. If I judge your motives, then you point that out to me, and I will apologize for it. There's not going to be any shouting matches. If you start shouting, I'm not going to get in a shouting match with you, and I'm not going to stand there and listen to you shout because you're sinning, and I'm not going to participate in that. I will not lie to protect you. I won't lie to your boss. I won't lie to creditors. I won't lie to your employees or to your customers if a man has his own business. She will not shelter him from creditors if he's not providing properly for his family. There's not going to be any more adultery. There will be no more. There will be no adultery. There will be no physical abuse. No excusing with the children, where the woman is not going to be making excuses to the children because daddy lost his temper and trying to smooth it over with them. And she's going to expect him to solve sexual problems, to study and to learn if there is sexual neglect in the family. So these are all ways that wives participate with their husband's sins. And if we set boundaries, then we're not going to be participating in these sins. I want to tell you about two women that I know that set boundaries when they first got married that I think were very good boundaries to set. There was one gal who came and was talking to me about some of the marriage problems that she had. Her husband was not a Christian, and her husband worked in a pornographic bookstore. And she said her husband would come home and he'd tell her about how that afternoon he'd been sitting on the edge of a bed of one of his friends at one of his friends' house, and his friend is in bed with a woman that he's not married to. And so this gal's husband was continually surrounded by all kinds of sexual immorality. And in the course of talking to her, I said, "Are you sure that he's never committed adultery there? Are you sure that he's always been faithful to you?" And she says, "Oh, yes." She says, "I am positive. There is no doubt in my mind that he has never committed adultery." Because she said, when we first got married, she said, "I told him that God gives me the right to divorce you if you commit adultery, and I will divorce you. I will not tolerate any kind of adultery whatsoever." And she says, "I am convinced that there is absolutely no adultery in our marriage." And so she set a boundary before they ever got married with a man who was not a Christian. And as 1 Corinthians 7 that we talked about earlier is talking about a woman living with a man who is not a Christian, she set that boundary. That man knew exactly where she stood. And he knew that if he strayed, it was going to cost him his marriage. And he respected that boundary. Another woman said in the early years of her marriage, said word drifted back that her husband's brother had hit his wife. And she knew that her husband had kind of come from a rough family, and she knew that that might be a tendency that he had. So she set a boundary. She told him before the issue ever came up in their marriage, she said, "If you ever lay a hand on me, that's it. There's not going to be any coming back. There's not going to be any reconciliation. If you ever lay a hand on me, I'm walking, and that's the end of it." That man never, ever laid a hand on his wife. They developed good communication skills, and today have a very beautiful marriage. And when she tells that story, she's taking a certain amount of credit because their marriage is very different from what his brother and his dad had because of the way they treated their women. So we need to set boundaries that are very plain, to be very determined that we're going to keep these boundaries. We're not intimidated. We're not cowardly in practicing these boundaries. Then, if we're doing all these things, if we're recognizing our personal responsibility and accepting it, if we're keeping our life right with God, if we're confessing our faults, and if we are not participating in sin, if we are not being codependent, then it is going to be easy for us to do this last thing on here, which is maintain a healthy self-image. We've talked about this some before in the Song of Solomon. How in the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 1, the Shulamite said, "I am the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valley. Solomon, I don't have to marry you. I can be particular. I can take time to choose whoever I want." In Proverbs 31, verses 18 and 25, this is where the woman of great price had a very healthy self-image. She felt good about what she did and smiled at the future. So we see a young woman and an older woman both having a good, healthy self-image. I'm convinced from what I've read and learned about codependency is that when a woman develops a codependent attitude, it damages her self-image. It causes her to not think as highly of herself as she should. And then as she rids herself of that codependent attitude and starts accepting responsibility for her life and not participating in sin, then she begins to heal her self-image so that she can have a healthy self-image. Then, as we love ourselves, as we have this attitude of loving ourselves in this way, then what we need to do is we need to turn around and love other people exactly the same way. And the first thing we need to do when we love other people is that we need to recognize they have a personal responsibility too, and we need to let them accept their own personal responsibility. In 1 Peter 1, verse 17, this is another general principle about personal responsibility. In verse 17 it says, "And if you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each man's work, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay upon the earth, knowing that you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your futile way of life inherited from your forefathers." So here it is, it says that God impartially judges according to each man's work. God judges everyone individually. And when we allow the other person to accept their personal responsibility, this is what codependency is, what they call detachment. When Abigail told Nabal what had happened about how he had nearly been killed and what she had done with David, this is what codependent people would call detachment. I have in your notes a quote from a lady who wrote me in one of the surveys that came back. She was a woman who was an abused wife. And she says, what a world in that word told. That's how she had backed off from Nabal and she just presented the facts to him. that she told him and she let him accept his responsibility. She didn't nag him, she didn't coerce him, she didn't try to make him feel guilty. She just simply laid the facts out for him and let him deal with them. Let him accept his responsibility. Then I have down here, here are examples of where God has judged men and women, or husbands and wives individually, and we need to realize that we're going to stand before God not as a husband and wife team, but as an individual. The story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, God punished them both separately because of their sin. He held them both responsible for their sin separately. The story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5, verses 1 through 11. I remember how Ananias came in and lied about the property he had sold and how much money he had gotten for it. Then when Sapphira, his wife, came in, she was given an opportunity to either tell the truth or to lie, and she chose to go along with her husband and to lie, and her life was taken just as Ananias' life was taken. Then the story of Ahab and Jezebel. The Bible talks about how there never was a man so wicked as Ahab, whose wife Jezebel incited him to do wickedness. And yet when God came along to punish Ahab and Jezebel, he punished Ahab individually, he punished Jezebel individually, and he punished their sons who were involved in wickedness separately too, in 1 Kings 21, verses 25 and 29. Then you remember the story of Achan in Joshua 7, how that they sent the people in to fight a battle, and they were told not to take any spoil from them, but Achan took some spoil. He dug a hole in his tent and buried it in his tent. And then when they went to battle again, instead of them conquering the people, they were defeated. And then God let them know that Achan was the one who had done this thing. And when they stoned and killed Achan, they not only killed Achan, but they also killed Achan's wife and his children. And for a long time I wondered, why in the world did God kill Achan's wife? What did she do? Well, I suspect if he had buried the booty that he had taken in the middle of his tent, she knew about it, she was privy to it, and she went along with him in his sin. She was punished for supporting her husband in sin. And let's turn over to Deuteronomy 13, verses 6 through 10, and notice a general principle that God had for the Jews as far as our dealing with our husbands, or our husbands dealing with us in an area of sin. Deuteronomy 13, verses 6 through 10. And here it says, if your brother, your mother's son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is as your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, of the gods of the peoples who are around you, near you or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end, you shall not yield to him or listen to him, and your eyes shall not pity him, nor shall you spare or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So here it is, if God is saying that if your brother, your mother's son, or your daughter, or your wife, or your best friend come along and commit some sin, then what do you do in verse 8? It says, you shall not spare him, or you shall not conceal him. You shall be the first to raise your hand. When there is sin in our home, God does not want a wife concealing her husband's sin, or her son's sin, or her relative's sin. That relative has an opportunity to know that before anybody else because of all the sins that take place in the home, and they are to expose it and to deal with it in a righteous way. So we need to recognize that other person, our spouse, has a personal responsibility, and we cannot take it away from him. We can try, but God is not going to accept that. Now down here, God gives everyone the right to be a jerk, and a wife does not have the right to take that away from her husband. God gives our husbands the right to be jerks. He gives them the right to sin, just as he gives us the right to be jerks and to sin. And we cannot take that right away from anyone. In Ezekiel 3, verse 27, I'm not going to take the time to read that right now, but in Ezekiel 3:27, he's talking about that when we see someone sinning, then we have an obligation to point that out to them, and if we don't, then that person's blood is going to be on our head. Their responsibility is to either do something about it or to not do anything about it. It's not our responsibility what they do. It's simply our responsibility to point out what they're doing wrong. And then it is their responsibility to act accordingly. Revelation 22:11. Let's look at that right quick. Revelation 22:11. Okay, and here it says, "Let the one who does wrong still do wrong, and let the one who is filthy still be filthy, and let the one who is righteous still practice righteousness, and let the one who is holy still keep himself holy." So if we're married to someone who wants to do wrong, let him do wrong. If he's filthy, let him be filthy. If he wants to be righteous, then let him be righteous. Let him accept the responsibility for his behavior instead of us trying to control him. It's our responsibility to warn him, as we see here in Ezekiel 3, verses 17 through 21. Have down here what an elder in Texas says. He says, if he poops in his mess kit, let him clean it up. So if he makes a mess with his life, if he makes a mess with his temper, if he makes a mess with his life in committing adultery, if he makes a mess with his life through alcohol, whatever it is, then we shouldn't be codependent. We should let him clean it up. Let him accept responsibility for his life, and let him take charge of what it is he needs to do. I want to tell you a story about a couple. This man was a verbal abuser. He abused his wife and he abused his children. And they had been married for 20-some years, and he had been doing this. And this woman would come over to our house, and she'd talk to my husband and myself, well, what about this? And it's harming the children. And my husband, he would tell her this. He says, well, just like the elder in Texas says, if he poops in his mess kit, let him clean it up. You quit going around and trying to smooth things over for him, and you quit trying to correct things for him. You let him suffer the consequences of his actions. Not too long after this happened, this fella and his wife and their son were at a school function, and one of the neighbor kids who hassled his kids happened to be there, and this fella, who was a Christian, began to browbeat this neighbor in a very loud tone publicly. He began to say things like, well, I ought to stomp your head in, and just all kinds of abusive things publicly to him. Well, the wife started trying to get her husband out of this place, because here's the principal and all the teachers and the boy's mother, and she's afraid he's going to get arrested. Well, he immediately turns on her. You're never on my side. You're always on the other person's side, and begins to browbeat her just like he's browbeating the kid. Well, she finally gets him out of there, and she takes him home, and she tells him, she says, I'm going to go get Sam. That was her solution to the problem. So she left him at home, and she went to the building. And we were in a special committee meeting at the building. And so she came in and got him and took him out, my husband out. And so Sam says, I'm sorry, I can't go over there tonight. This meeting is too important, and I've got to be here. You tell him I will come see him tomorrow morning. So the next morning, this fella called my husband bright and early, and he says, I know what I did was wrong, and that I shouldn't have done it. He says, you don't need to come talk to me. My husband says, well, I'm going to come talk to you anyway. And so he went over and talked to him. Well, the fellow went forward, and he confessed sin, since his sin had been a public sin, but it wasn't over with yet. He still had some consequences to endure. The mother of the boy called a lawyer and had a lawyer talk to him and was threatening to sue him because of the way he was acting, and he didn't know whether he was going to be sued, whether he was going to end up in jail. And he had to sweat some of that out for a while, and his wife just sat back and let him sweat it out all by himself, let him suffer the consequences all by himself. And that man began to come face to face with some of his problems. But that's not the end of the story. Prior to this happening, I was working on Volume 2, and I had asked this woman to proofread Volume 2 for me because I knew that they had some sexual problems, and I wanted to see the effect of this book on her, and I knew she'd give me some good feedback. And when I asked her if she'd read my book for me and proofread it for me, she says, oh, you don't want me to proofread it. She says, it'll only make me mad. And I said, that's okay. You can get mad if you want to, but you have to talk to me about it. I want to know what you think about it. So there'd be lots of times I'd go to services, and boy, she'd be just as mad as she could be, and we'd go into a classroom and we'd talk. And later on, I found out that when I asked her to proofread that book, she was in the process of thinking how she could leave her husband and get everything together so she could leave him, and I didn't know that. So we were really working on a lot of feelings. And a big part of their problem was that her husband had a real strong sexual drive, and she wasn't a prude, but she was turned off by all of this verbal abuse all day long, and she wasn't ready to be all cozy at night then because of the way that he treated her. So she began to realize that she was going to have to deal with some of these problems, and they were going to have to learn to communicate if their sex life was going to be what it should. Should be. One Sunday they came to services, and I happened to be sitting behind them, and there was just this feeling between them that you could just see. I'd never seen them act like that before. So later I says, what happened? There's something between you two, something really special. And she says, we had a talk this weekend. She says, I got a lot of things off of my chest, and he got a lot of things off his chest, and we cleared a lot of the air. Okay, and about this point is when the incident happened at school with him abusing the boy at school. So after that incident happened, then my book came out, was published, and I gave her a copy of it, and she took it home, and she had already read it, but she just left it laying around for him to read. And I had some things in there just especially for him, because she'd been talking to me about how it turns off a woman when her husband is verbally abusive. And so she said she'd come home from work, and she said I always knew when he was reading your book, because he's especially nice to me those evenings. And she says after he read the book, and she says that then this was a man who cared about God, but yet he was involved in a sin. And what was convicting this man is the Scriptures, reading the Scriptures and seeing that the thing he wanted the most, which was to satisfy his wife sexually, that he wasn't doing because of the way he was treating her. This man was convicted in that sin, and she says one day she came home from work, and he apologized to her for all the ugly things he had said and done for 20-some years, and he was so sorry, and she forgave him. The next day she came home from work, and he apologized again, and she says, I forgive you. The next day she came home from work, and he apologized again, and she says, I forgive you. This went on all week long, and she finally says, look, we can't go back and live the past over. She says, I forgive you, and we can go ahead and make the future be something really marvelous. We can have a really great future together. And so they put the past behind them. She called me a year later, and she says, I want you to know that my husband, I'm convinced, has really changed. He hasn't gone back to any of his old ways. And she says, life is better than when we first got married, and our sex life is so great, I never thought it could be this great. She called me a couple of years later, and she said, it's still great. He still hasn't gone back to the way he was, and life is still great. And I'm convinced by her letting him accept responsibility for his actions, for him nearly being sued and nearly going to jail, made him come face to face with his abusive behavior. And then the man was sanctified. He studied God's Word. He learned what God wanted him to do, and he truly, truly changed 100%. Sometimes people don't allow women to, or try to force wives to accept responsibility for their husbands many times in the church. Other Christians will. If a husband is out of duty, not attending like he should, or some kind of a problem, instead of going and talking to the husband, they go talk to the wife. Well, tell your husband we really miss him, or tell your husband this, or tell him that. Well, that's not that wife's responsibility to relay messages to her husband. That's her husband's responsibility, and a wife ought to refuse to carry messages like that. In fact, I know one woman who was in that position who finally told I think it was the preacher who was continually telling her to go tell her husband something. She said, look, we're not joined at the hips. You go tell him and let him get the message that way. And so a woman needs to let her husband accept responsibility for his own problems. Had a woman call me long distance, and she says, I've really got a problem. She and her husband were bikers, and we knew them from our biking days. And her husband is also a perfectionist. It takes him hours to get ready to ride his bike, because everything has to be so-so, and she's also a biker, and she'll pack her bike and have it ready, and he'll go over there and redo hers. He's just such a perfectionist. She says she gave up years ago about worrying about him getting to work on time. That's his problem. Just if he's late, then that's between him and his boss. But anyway, the people they ride bikes with begin to talk to her. Can't you hurry him up? Can't you make him go a little bit faster? We're tired of waiting on him. And she says, I'm starting to resent these people because they're wanting me to correct him. And she says, I've learned a long time ago he's going to always be this way. And so I told her this story about the lady who said she wasn't joined at the hips. I said, it's not your responsibility. You need to tell these people to relay their own messages. So that was what she did. She went back to these people and said, this is not my fault. This is not my problem. If you have a problem, you go and talk to him. It's something that he needs to deal with. Another way sometimes that people do not allow a wife to allow her husband to accept his own responsibilities. I was told a story about a preacher who verbally abused his wife. Continually, every time she'd do something good, then he would chew her out and say, well, you've got ugly motives. You only did that nice thing for those people because you're trying to get something out of them. You're trying to make them think you're better than you are. And just continually verbally abused her, so that she was so depressed and so down that her whole system was shut down, and the doctor told her, if you don't get yourself turned around, you're going to die, because your whole system is just shutting down, your whole body. And so this woman decided she'd had enough and she'd leave her husband. And she did leave him. And the elders came and talked to her. And instead of dealing with her husband's verbal abuse, they said, if you do not go back to your husband, we will fire him. Now, his job was his responsibility. That was a terrible burden to lay on that wife. That was his responsibility. And if he got fired because he was such a horrible verbal abuser, his wife was at death's door, then that was his responsibility. That was his problem. And so we need to allow our husbands to be responsible. And we need to also allow the people that we're working with to allow their husbands to be responsible. At the women's shelter in Santa Maria, they do not do anything for the women that come into the shelter. They will give them help as far as they say, we'll help you fill out forms, but we will not take you to the courthouse to get them. We will not take you to the welfare office to get housing. We'll help you fill out the forms. But you have got to do these things for yourself, because they have found that if these people, they are so codependent with their husbands, they are so shut down with their systems that they are not accepting responsibility for themselves. And if they do everything for them, then these people are not going to be growing and developing as they should. Okay, so the first thing, if we're going to love others as we love ourselves, is we need to allow them to accept their own responsibilities. And then we need to not cover up for sin. In Ephesians 5:11, the general passage that we talked about last week. This one notes here again, says, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. Notice that the word expose here means to convict, refute, generally with a suggestion of the shame of the person convicted, to find fault with, correct, and I notice I have highlighted. Now, A is by a word. You correct them by word, expose them by word, reprehend severely, chide, admonish, call to account, or you do it by deed, to chasten or punish. So we can refuse to cover up their sins and expose them either by our word, what we say, or by a deed, such as giving them a restraining order or calling the police, something like that, which we're going to be talking about in a later class. So we don't cover up sin in any way. We refuse to cover it up. AA calls wives who cover up sin, it calls them enablers. Alcoholics, verbal abusers, etc., a common thing you hear them say is, I don't have a problem, you do. You're the one, you object to this, so you're the one that has the problem, and this is something that is not true, it's common, and we need to refuse to cover up their sins so that they can experience the consequences and realize that, yes, they do have a problem. In Proverbs 27, verse 6, okay, here it says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Sometimes the best way we can be on somebody's side or to be their friend is to wound them, to expose them, to help them see what it is they're doing wrong. Then we need to recognize that we don't assume the job of making him happy. That is not our job. If we start trying to make our husband happy all the time, then we're going to become codependent in a hurry. Colossians 3:19, we've read this a bunch of times. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. I know lots and lots of wives who have tried very hard for many, many years to make their husbands happy. And I don't know of a single wife who has succeeded. All they've succeeded in doing is making their husbands more unhappy, because the more a wife tries to make her husband think happy thoughts and have happy emotions, the more he depends upon his wife to make him think happy thoughts, the less he depends upon himself, and the more unhappy he becomes, and the more emotionally worn out she becomes, and the more unhappy she becomes. So this doesn't work. Finally, I have down here, forgiveness doesn't mean no consequences. In 1 Kings 21, verses 25 and 28, this is about Ahab that we talked about earlier. Never had a man been so wicked. And God came along and told Ahab, because you're so wicked, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill Jezebel, and I'm going to kill your children, and where all of your family falls, the animals, the dogs and the birds are going to come and eat their body. They're not going to be buried. And when Ahab heard this, Ahab repented. He put on sackcloth. He tore his clothing. He went around depressed for days. And God says, see, Ahab, see how he has really repented, and God forgave Ahab. I suspect from the way that passage is talking that Ahab is going to be in heaven with God. God forgave him. He truly repented. But God did not take away the consequences. God still killed his wife, God still killed his children, and God still killed Ahab. What God did, though, was God softened the consequences. God says all these things are going to happen, but they won't happen in your lifetime. You're not going to have to see your wife die. You're not going to have to see your children die. And so what God did was he took Ahab's life first, and then he took his children and his wife's life after he died. So just because we forgive our husband or our mate when they're involved in sin, that doesn't mean, okay, you're forgiven, no consequences. We're going to stop there for today.